Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Monday Bagel. Today we have a truly special guest, Professor Angela Zhang. Angela is a professor of law at the University of Southern California and one of the leading experts on Chinese tech regulation. Not only has she written extensively on the subject, but she has also authored two groundbreaking books, Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism and High Wire, How China Regulates Big Tech and Governs Its Economy. Angela, welcome to Monday Bagel. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's a great pleasure for me too. Thank you for having me.
To start things off, let's talk about China's approach to AI regulations. How does China regulatory framework compare to those of US and EU AI Act? Are there key differences or similarities that you find important?
Right. I mean, this is a great question. So, AI regulation is a very broad subject. When we are talking about EU AI Act, it's just a very small component of the overall AI regulation. Well, this is the same case for China as well. But if we are talking about more broadly how China's regulatory approach differs from other jurisdiction like EU and the United States, I think we need to really go back to the different institutional contexts, right? I mean, China obviously is an authoritarian country with its own unique values and ideologies. And its approach to regulation and governance is also significantly different from what you observe in other jurisdictions, particularly the liberal democracies. And this is something that I actually elaborate in detail in my second book, High Wire, because if we want to truly understand China's approach to AI regulation as well as other areas of policy enforcement, we really need to understand China's institutional context. We need to take an institutional approach to study regulation in China. And most specifically, we think about how policy making is done in China, right? I mean, it's a very hierarchical approach. So the first feature in the dynamic pyramid model I created to analyze China's regulation is hierarchy, right? I mean, it's at a tightly coupled hierarchy that is very different from what you observe in EU or the US, where you see more checks and balances in
Mhm.
policy making. And the second is that the policy process is very volatile. And often characterized by very dramatic regulatory pendulum swing, and that again differ China from other jurisdictions where you have more democratic restraints in agency actions. Even though you also see volatility, but it's not as such intensity as you observe in China. And lastly, is fragility that you tend to see. Even though a lot of the regulatory interventions may be well intentioned, however, they often generate vast unintended consequences. And partly because of the hierarchy and volatility, because both factors tend to lead to fragility in regulatory outcome.
Can you give some examples of this approach in some details? How is it regulated?
Yeah, I mean, AI is a cutting edge, revolutionary technology, particularly with the arrival of, the Chat GPT and the other
Mhm.
generative AI services. But before that, before the emergence of these technology, China has had a long history of regulating the digital economy, right? I mean, 20 years ago, since China started to develop its internet businesses, China used to take a very lax stand in regulating this sector. In a way, it's quite similar to the dynamic you observe with how the way China regulates AI these days, right? I mean, because when a new technology emerge, the Chinese government tends to take a very business friendly approach, or you can say very light touch regulatory approach in order to nurture this sector. And this used to be the stance of the government. So despite the fact that you see a lot of tension started to arise from the tech sector, there was a lot of complaints coming out from the platform participants. The government agencies, because they operate in a very hierarchical institutional setting, they respond to the top's initiative, right? I mean, so instead of taking proper and timely regulatory stands in disciplining the tech firms, they took a very lax stand. in dealing with these complaints, right? I mean, so as a result, these firms were not deterred, and they continued to grow recklessly and expanded exponentially during the past decade. And until things really got out of hand, and very recently, China initiated a massive crackdown over its largest big tech companies like Alibaba or Tencent, and once the
Mhm.
government, the central government, intervened and the top leadership sent out very strict policy signal, obviously everybody fall into line, including the firms as well, and they were able to rein in the companies at a lightning speed, at a speed that will make
Mhm.
European and U.S. regulators really jealous. But the thing is that this kind of dramatic regulatory pendulum swing really, put off investors, right? I mean, who were very confused about, China's policy directives with the trajectory of these firms, right? I mean, what is going on here? Why does the government suddenly turn its back against these companies, right? Even though, yes, a lot of these regulatory intervention actually are long overdue, but still, this kind of interventions, totally unpredictable for a lot of investors and entrepreneurs, really put them off. And that generate vast market repercussions. And as a result, the top 10 Chinese tech firm lost over $1 trillion market cap over the past couple of years, and that has not really come back. And because of the retreat of the private investment, um, this sector actually has not been able to attract new entries. So, despite the fact, look, I mean, they were intended to inject more competition into the sector in order to lower entry barrier, in order to foster more innovation. But the unintended consequence is that it actually reduced competition by reinforcing the incumbents' dominance in the sector because they were not able to attract more capital into the sector. And so, so this is the fragile regulatory outcome
Mhm.
resulting from this kind of very hierarchical model of regulatory intervention.
Okay, as a professor of law, I very often participate in discussion here in European Union, and very often China's AI laws are shown, presented as pro-growth in opposition to regulatory approach in the European Union. Is it true that it's so pro-growth for industry, and it has some impact on AI both domestically and globally?
Right. I mean, AI have a lot of application in a variety of industry setting. Let's give an example of the facial recognition technology. Okay, this is the most widely used AI technology in China. And China have achieved phenomenal technological progress and commercial success with this technology. And now China has the most accurate facial recognition technology. And when you go to a Chinese airport, you can see, you can basically go through a lot of the entry points without seeing a human because the facial recognition technology is so good. Now, how did China regulate facial recognition? Very little, like a very minimal stance. I mean, there are laws there, but its gather is very piecemeal. It's not that China doesn't have the capacity to regulate this. I mean, they have been drafting law to regulate facial recognition for years. And even last year, the Chinese government, the Cyberspace Administration of China, formally introduced a draft version of the facial recognition technology law. But to this day, it still hasn't been enacted. So that shows there is a lot of opposition within the government bureaucracy that oppose the introduction of law to curb its potentially that could curb its commercial use. So you are right. The impression you got from Europe, you are right that China indeed has taken a very industry friendly approach to regulate some of the AI technology, like facial recognition. And partly because of this lax stand, it also facilitates the exponential growth of this technology. And this is a fact. Now, but there are other types of AI technology that the Chinese government have more concern about. This is the generative AI because the AI output may not be aligned with
Mhm.
the political value of the Chinese Communist Party. So with that, with the concern of information control and content moderation, the Chinese government has taken a much more aggressive stance in regulating generative AI. And as you see, only 2 or 3 months after GPT emerged, China already cracked down over 100 GPT-like app services in Apple's App Store in China. And then 6 months after GPT emerged, China already became the first country to introduce rules to regulate generative AI. And in August last year, China already enacted this law and became the first country to have comprehensive measures to regulate generative AI. And the most important provision in the law, the interim measures to regulate this technology, is the requirement to conduct a security assessment.
Mhm.
Um, in other words, if you want to introduce generative AI services to the public, you need to get approval from the Cyberspace Administration of China and conduct proper testing to fulfill this security assessment requirement so that the agencies feel satisfied that the content generated will be political aligned. So this
Mhm.
is the bottom line of the Chinese Communist Party. They want to make sure that the AI output would not interfere with the public discourse. So you can see, it really depends on what type of AI technology we're talking about and how it fit in with the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party.
Really interesting. In your paper, you mentioned also that China's AI policies could influence global standards. We in Europe think about Brussels effect, how regulations should impact and shape international AI norms. What do you think about Chinese ones? Will China play an important role in development of global standards in AI field?
Right, very good question. So the paper you mentioned is a paper recently wrote called "The Promise and Perils of China's Regulation of Artificial Intelligence." AI legislation is actually trying to send friendly signal to the industry and investors, and try to coordinate various industry participants to foster AI growth. And one of the things that it's trying to foster is to coordinate international rulemaking. And China, as you said, has great ambition not only in becoming an AI superpower, but also become a global leader in AI rulemaking. Partly because once you set the standard, it bring in enormous commercial benefits, right? I mean, just like while Huawei become the standard setter of 5G technology, and that has enormous commercial implications. So China has been very active in participating a lot of the standard setting bodies in trying to influence AI standard making. However, because China is not a leader in generative AI technology, right? I mean, so its influence in shaping the standard setting with that particular technology is somewhat less limited than what it has been able to achieve with 5G technology. But definitely, this is an area that China is trying to work on, right? Because of the enormous commercial benefits behind. And on the other hand, China also have the ambition to influence and lead developing countries in the global south. Because, as you know, China has been subject to a lot of the regulation, even though it doesn't regulate its own domestic company, but it's subject to a lot of regulation from the United States because the US government is imposing tight restrictions on Chinese firms to access advanced AI chips from NVIDIA, and also to access advanced AI equipment from some of the European companies, like from the Netherlands, right? So China is trying to rally the global South to gain some voices in AI governance, right? I mean, it shouldn't be that certain advanced countries in the West are depriving our opportunity to develop this technology by imposing this unreasonable export control measures, right? I mean, which on the one hand they said they were doing this for for concern of national security, because AI could have military use application. But the
Mhm.
thing is that for military use, you don't need advanced AI chip. You can rely on legacy chips.
Yeah.
So this kind of export control appears more to, kind of stifle China's AI growth, and lacks very clear this kind of moral support in a way. So you can see China also trying to shape the global rhetoric in AI governance and have a voice, particularly very active in the United Nations, where it can channel a lot of influence in a way also to rally this kind of international support for its stance in AI governance.
In your latest book, you provide some incredible insights into how China tries to regulate tech sector. And could you give some key takeaways for European Union or for US? How to approach and how to balance control and innovation? Are we correct? Do we behave properly, or should we change anything, taking knowledge and experience from China?
China represents a very extreme example of regulation and governance, right? I mean, in a way, China had been doing too little, and obviously, and then suddenly doing too much.
Mhm.
And that kind of volatile regulatory model of enforcement hasn't done well for China. In many ways, have undermined its most dynamic tech sector. If you think about it, has how much has the US or EU differ from China? I don't think they differ qualitatively. It's only a matter of extent, right? I mean, for instance, in the United States, you can see also a lot of pendulum swing with the government's approach in regulating big tech. However, what differs in the US is that it has a very robust judicial review system. So agency action is checked by the judiciary and actually subject
Mhm.
to very rigorous judicial scrutiny, right? I mean, so this kind of democratic constraints on regulatory actions does provide more robustness and stability in the system, which I think is actually a great thing. So we should cherish this kind of checks and balance. Yes, it will actually make it look less efficient, because that's precisely why you see, for so many years, U.S. hasn't achieved much with regulating its own big tech firms, right? I mean, and
Mhm.
that's why a lot of progressive policymakers and scholars have felt very frustrated with how much they were able to achieve, and despite very aggressive push. But in many ways, if you look at what China was able to achieve so quickly, you might not want your pendulum swing to move so quickly. Sometimes moving too fast could actually generate even more problems. Democracy is definitely not the
Mhm.
most efficient, but
Yes.
it's still the best among the worst, right? Now, when you look at EU, for instance, which is way more progressive than the US counterparts and have been more, in many ways, more aggressive in reining in big techs and introducing a lot of the very innovative legal mechanisms like ex ante regulations, the Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, and now with the EU AI Act and a bunch of other directives going on. I mean, they have formulated the world's most comprehensive regulatory tools, arsenals to discipline big tech firms, right? Um, but we know very little about the consequences of these regulations, right? I mean, we mostly heard from the regulators about the potential benefits, and why the previous tools were not sufficient, were not satisfactory. But we know very little about the new tools and what could be the potential unintended consequences.
Mhm.
This is the big deal. I mean, these are the science facts that we have been talking about and that you observe from the Chinese regime. And so I think that it is truly important for us to get some feedback and evaluation of regulatory innovations, And EU should learn from China's experience, right? I
Mhm.
mean, taking aggressive stance may generate vast unintended consequences. So we have to be cautious in rolling out some of these measures, not to deter innovation, not to stifle growth, and also in a way to give investors a clear expectation. And that's important. This kind of stability is important, and it matters hugely for the growth and development of technology.
I think such the discussions as we have today are really important to cross the bubbles, to cross the European bubble or Chinese bubble, and to get some knowledge across them. Is there any final advice for European or U.S. legal professionals where to find knowledge about Chinese AI regulations? Of course, they should follow and read your books, but are there any 2 or 3 places on the web where there is knowledge for us to find out how China is developing?
Yeah, I mean, so Concordian AI, which is a nonprofit organization, has done a very good job in monitoring the development of Chinese AI safety and research. And they have consistently published very high quality research reports in this area. So I highly recommend your audience to take a look. And Matt Shinhand from Carnegie Endowment, based in Washington, D.C., has also been a very close watcher of China's AI. And he has also published several influential reports on China's AI regulations and safety development, and as well as Jeffrey Ding, who is an assistant professor from Georgetown University. He is also a long-time close observer of China's AI development, although not necessarily from a legal perspective, but he's closely following the industry trend. As I said, look, I mean, with AI regulation in China, we can't disassociate the law from the institutional environment. So we need to understand the industry, we need to understand the policy, we need to understand the firm, right? We need to understand all the major players in the Chinese AI ecosystem in order to understand, to predict and have a better understanding of the future regulatory trend of Chinese AI technology.
Thank you so much, Angela. It's been an enlightening conversation. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's a great honor. Thanks for having me.
And for those who want to dive deeper, I highly recommend your latest book, High Wire: How China Regulates Big Tech and Governs Its Economy. I will link it under the episode. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in today. And until next time, take care and see you next Monday. Bye.
Bye.